A black woman quietly takes her seat in first class, ready for a rare moment of peace after months of tireless work. But just as the plane begins to board, a flight attendant approaches, demanding she move to another seat, insisting there must have been a mistake. Unwilling to cause a scene, the woman calmly refuses, standing firm with quiet grace. Minutes later, the entire crew learns the shocking truth about who she really is, sending ripples through the airline that no one saw coming. What happened next not only changed the course of the flight but left passengers stunned and sparked a conversation that reached far beyond the cabin. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, be sure to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. The hum of the airplane was steady and low, like the distant rolling of thunder on a calm afternoon. Maya Coleman let herself sink into the leather embrace of seat 1A. The soft sigh of comfort barely escaping her lips. She glanced out the window, where the last ribbons of sunlight streaked across the tarmac, bathing the plane in hues of orange and pink. It had been a long week, too long. Contracts, board meetings, sleepless nights spent reviewing spreadsheets and strategies that stretched her mind thin. This seat, this small corner of peace at the front of the cabin, was not just a luxury. It was a hard-earned reward, paid for by years of relentless determination and the steady climb up a ladder that had often been pulled from beneath her feet. She crossed her legs carefully, her silk scarf catching the light, a quiet reminder of the elegance she had learned to wield like armor. The weight of her leather briefcase sat beneath the seat in front of her, a constant companion, filled with documents and ideas that had taken her from a small neighborhood in Newark to the helm of her own tech company. But the peace did not last. It rarely did. The sound arrived first, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the cabin's stillness. High heels, tapping with precision and confidence, echoed down the aisle. Maya did not need to turn her head to know the source of the disruption. She felt it before she saw it, the familiar tension, the prickle at the nape of her neck that had accompanied her into boardrooms, cocktail parties, and networking events for years. Two women approached, one tall and severe, the other a step behind, like an accessory to the first. Evelyn Blake's platinum hair gleamed under the cabin lights, her designer bag hanging from her elbow as if she carried the world itself. She scanned the cabin like a queen surveying her kingdom, until her gaze locked onto Maya. It happened then, the pause, that half-second of hesitation, the narrowing of eyes that whispered an unspoken question. What is she doing here? Maya felt the weight of Evelyn's stare, but she did not flinch. She kept her eyes on the briefcase in front of her, casually flipping open the buckle. She had lived through this scene too many times to count. Excuse me, Evelyn's voice sliced through the air. Maya turned her head slowly, her expression neutral, her heart steady. Yes? I believe there's been a mistake, Evelyn said, her tone polite but brittle, as if politeness itself were an inconvenience. This is my seat. Maya arched a brow. She glanced down at the gold-embossed 1A printed clearly on her boarding pass and then back at Evelyn. I don't believe so. I reserved this seat weeks ago. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. The woman beside her shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. You see, Evelyn tried again, softening her smile in the way one might when explaining something to a child. I'm a gold-tier member with the airline. I always sit in 1A. It's part of the program. The words lingered, not so much a request as a declaration, one that expected compliance. Maya didn't move. I'm sure you do, she replied, but today, 1A is mine. For a moment, the cabin held its breath. Evelyn's companion tugged at her sleeve gently, whispering something beneath her breath. But Evelyn did not retreat. Perhaps, Evelyn said, her smile fading into something cooler. You'd be more comfortable elsewhere. Maya met Evelyn's gaze directly now, letting the weight of her silence speak louder than any retort she could muster. I'm perfectly comfortable, Maya said at last, right where I am. The tension grew, twisting tighter like the pull of a string ready to snap. Evelyn's hand gripped the back of the empty seat next to Maya, her knuckles pale. Is there a problem here? The flight attendant's voice, calm but firm, interrupted them. Greg, his neatly pressed uniform crisp against the soft light of the cabin, glanced between the two women. Evelyn wasted no time. Yes, there is. This seat has been mistakenly assigned. I'm supposed to be here. Greg turned to Maya. May I see your ticket? Ma'am? Maya offered it without hesitation, her eyes never leaving Evelyn's. The attendant examined the slip, nodded, and handed it back. "There's no mistake, Mrs. Blake," Greg said, his voice clipped but polite. "Seat 1A belongs to Miss Coleman." A flicker of disbelief passed over Evelyn's face, but she recovered quickly. "Perhaps she purchased a last-minute upgrade," Evelyn offered, her tone still light, though the edges of her patience frayed visibly. "People do that sometimes." Greg shifted uncomfortably. "I'm afraid not. Miss Coleman is a platinum member as well." The words landed like a stone between them. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest moment, Maya saw the crack in the polished exterior Evelyn wore like armor. But it was fleeting. Evelyn straightened, drawing herself to full height as if reclaiming whatever power she felt had slipped away. "I'm not sure you understand," Evelyn said quietly. "I always fly in this seat. Always." Maya allowed a thin smile to curve her lips. "I suppose there's a first time for everything." The quiet sharpness in Maya's tone was not lost on Evelyn. The blonde woman inhaled deeply, as if preparing for a fight she wasn't ready to lose. But before Evelyn could speak, Maya leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with quiet intensity. "Mrs. Blake," Maya said, her voice low, "I've spent years earning my place in rooms where people like you believed I didn't belong. This seat is no different. I suggest you find yours." Evelyn's companion tugged her sleeve again, this time more insistently. "Let it go," she whispered. But Evelyn wasn't ready. Not yet. The storm was still building. The tension clung to the air long after Evelyn Blake and her companion settled into seats several rows behind Maya. It was the kind of silence that wasn't really silence at all, the kind that prickled at the back of the neck and hummed beneath the surface, waiting to bloom into something more dangerous. Maya could feel the eyes. She didn't need to look to know that Evelyn's gaze still burned into her back. Or that other passengers, feigning disinterest, were stealing glances over the tops of their newspapers and tablets. This wasn't new. Maya had grown accustomed to existing under a microscope, where the slightest misstep could be magnified and twisted into confirmation of every unspoken doubt. She shifted slightly in her seat, reclaiming her space in a way that wasn't aggressive but deliberate, like someone smoothing out the edges of a flag planted firmly in the soil. The cabin lights dimmed as the last few passengers filtered in, and for a fleeting moment, Maya let herself believe that the storm had passed. She pulled out her notebook and let the familiar weight of it rest on her lap, flipping open the cover with practiced ease. The smooth glide of her pen across paper was grounding, each stroke a quiet reminder of the work she had done to reach this point. But peace, as always, was short-lived. A soft murmur drifted down the aisle, carried by the hushed yet insistent voice of Evelyn Blake. Maya caught fragments of the conversation, the clipped frustration in Evelyn's tone curling around words like unbelievable and ridiculous. "She's not done." Maya kept her eyes on the page, but her ears stayed sharp, tuned to the quiet battle brewing just beyond her shoulder. It wasn't long before Greg, the flight attendant, returned. His polite smile had thinned into something tighter, the weight of Evelyn's indignation visibly pressing down on him. "Miss Coleman," Greg said softly, leaning slightly toward her. "May I have a quick word?" Maya closed her notebook carefully, as if sealing away whatever calm she had managed to gather. She met Greg's eyes, her expression steady but not unkind. "Of course," she replied, though she already knew what was coming. Greg knelt beside her seat, his voice low and cautious. "Mrs. Blake has requested to speak with the flight supervisor regarding her seating arrangement. She's asked if you'd consider relocating just to avoid any further issue." Maya tilted her head slightly, studying Greg's face for a long, silent moment. She recognized the flicker of discomfort in his eyes, the same discomfort she had encountered so many times before. In boardrooms and hotel lobbies, in boutiques and country clubs. The same discomfort that seemed to arise when the world found itself at odds with a simple, unshakable truth: she wasn't going anywhere. "Greg," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I understand Mrs. Blake's frustration, but I paid for this seat. I'll be staying in it." A brief flash of relief flickered across his face, though he quickly masked it beneath the practiced neutrality of someone trained to navigate delicate situations. "Thank you for understanding," Greg said, rising to his feet, but as he turned, the steeliness in Evelyn's voice struck the air like a crack of lightning. Excuse me? Evelyn called from behind them, her words sharp enough to cut through the low murmur of the cabin. Did she say no? Greg hesitated for a beat too long. It was all the confirmation Evelyn needed. That's unacceptable, Evelyn snapped, rising from her seat. I need to speak with someone higher up. This is absurd. Heads turned now, curiosity blooming into full attention. Evelyn wasn't hiding behind hushed tones anymore. This was a performance, and the audience was rapt. Maya closed her eyes briefly, inhaling slowly through her nose. When she opened them again, Evelyn was standing just a few feet away, glaring down at her with the righteous indignation of someone who had never been told no in a language they understood. Maya didn't flinch. Is there something I can help you with, Mrs. Blake? Maya's voice was calm, but each word carried weight, carefully measured and laid out like stones across a river. You can help by taking another seat, Evelyn said, folding her arms tightly across her chest. I don't know why this is even a discussion. The quiet hum of the plane seemed louder now, filling the spaces where no one dared to speak. Even Greg, who lingered awkwardly between them, seemed to shrink under the weight of Evelyn's expectation. Maya let the silence linger, allowing Evelyn's words to echo just long enough to settle uneasily in the air. Then, she spoke. I'm curious, Mrs. Blake, Maya said, her eyes unwavering. Would you have made the same request if I looked different? The words hung there, and for the first time, Evelyn hesitated. I beg your pardon? Evelyn's voice faltered slightly, but her chin jutted forward in defiance. Maya didn't smile, but there was a softness to her tone that left no room for misunderstanding. I think you heard me just fine. A faint ripple passed through the cabin, passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Greg's face paled, his gaze flickering nervously between them. You're making this about something it's not, Evelyn snapped, her voice rising again. This isn't personal. It never is, Maya replied, folding her hands gently over her lap. Until it is. Greg's radio crackled softly, and he pressed a finger to his earpiece, nodding at whatever voice spoke quietly on the other end. The flight supervisor will be here shortly, he announced, his voice just loud enough to cut through the tension. I'd appreciate it if everyone could remain seated. Evelyn huffed, but she returned to her seat with a loud, exaggerated sigh, casting one last glare at Maya before she settled down. Maya exhaled slowly, turning her gaze back to the window. The sky outside had darkened, but the cabin lights glowed softly overhead, casting long shadows that stretched across the faces of passengers still watching her. She smiled faintly to herself, the kind of smile that comes when you've seen this all before. The game was just beginning. The supervisor arrived with a crispness that tried too hard to feel like authority. Deborah Lane, middle-aged, with the weariness of someone who had spent too long diffusing egos at 35,000 feet. Her smile was polite, but her eyes betrayed her. She had seen it too. Good evening, ladies. I understand there's been a misunderstanding about seat assignments? Deborah's voice was light, but her gaze flicked between Maya and Evelyn with the precision of someone reading the room like a ledger. Maya kept her back straight, her hands still resting gently over the cover of her notebook. There's no misunderstanding, she replied, her tone even. I reserved this seat. Deborah's nod was slow, deliberate. Her glance toward Evelyn carried the silent acknowledgement of someone who had witnessed Evelyn's kind before. I see, Deborah said carefully. Mrs. Blake, may I check your boarding pass? Just to confirm everything? Evelyn's hand shot forward before the question had fully left Deborah's lips, her platinum nails glinting as she pressed the paper into the supervisor's palm. Evelyn's confidence did not waver. She had played this game many times before. I always fly 1A, Evelyn said, her voice silk wrapped in steel. It's not complicated. Maya watched as Deborah's eyes scanned the ticket. The slight tightening of her jaw, so faint most wouldn't notice, told Maya everything she needed to know. Evelyn wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this seat. I'm afraid there's no error, Deborah said after a long pause. Your seat is in 3C today, Mrs. Blake. Evelyn blinked as if the words were foreign, as if she had not heard English for the first time in her life. I'm sorry, she said, her voice sharp enough to slice the air between them. That can't be right. But it was right, and everyone knew it. Evelyn's indignation did not stem from confusion. No, this was the arrogance of certainty, the kind of certainty that comes when the world has always stepped aside for you. And now, It refused to move. Evelyn's lips pursed, and Maya could feel the weight of what was coming next long before the words left her mouth. I don't think you understand who I am. Maya's fingers tightened slightly over the cover of her notebook. But she said nothing. Let the woman talk. Let her unravel herself. I have been a Platinum Elite member for 15 years. Evelyn continued, her gaze flicking to the other passengers who pretended not to watch but absorbed every word. I spend more money with this airline in a month than most people spend in a year. And I don't expect to be treated like this. Like this. The words hung there, unspoken but loud enough to shake the bones. Maya felt them land, heavy with implication. Deborah shifted, visibly uncomfortable now, but still locked in the rules of diplomacy. I understand, Mrs. Blake, Deborah said, but seat assignments are non-transferable once boarding begins. I'd be happy to. Evelyn's voice cut through Deborah's like ice breaking over still water. No, I don't want another seat. Evelyn snapped, turning to face Maya fully now. I want this seat, and I'm not sure why she, Evelyn's eyes flicked over Maya's frame, feels the need to make this so difficult. The cabin seemed to still, as if holding its collective breath. For a moment, the hum of the engines felt far away, drowned beneath the weight of Evelyn's words. Maya's eyes met Evelyn's without flinching. Perhaps, Maya said quietly, the difficulty isn't coming from where you think it is. Evelyn's face flushed, and something shifted in the air, something small, but vital. The balance of power had begun to tilt. Before Evelyn could respond, Maya lifted her boarding pass with the same calm, deliberate precision that had carried her through boardrooms filled with men who underestimated her. She held it out for Deborah to see. The 1A printed bold and undeniable. I suggest, Maya said, her voice soft but cutting, that we put an end to this. Deborah hesitated, but only for a second. Miss Coleman is correct, she said, folding her hands in front of her. She's in the right seat. I'm sorry, Mrs. Blake, but I must ask you to return to your assigned seat now. Evelyn's mouth opened ready to argue, to bargain, to threaten, but nothing came. The silence around her left little room to maneuver. Slowly, Evelyn leaned in, lowering her voice so that only Maya could hear. You think you've won something today? Evelyn whispered, but don't mistake this for anything more than luck. Maya smiled faintly, the kind of smile that knows things far beyond luck. Mrs. Blake, Maya whispered back, I don't believe in luck. The tension didn't break so much as it shifted, curling beneath the surface like an undertow. Evelyn lingered for just a second longer before finally turning away, her heels clicking sharply as she made her way down the aisle to 3C. The cabin exhaled in unison, but Maya knew the matter was far from over. The storm hadn't passed, it had simply moved to the horizon. The plane hadn't left the gate, but Maya could already feel the altitude shift. Not in her ears, no. This was different. This was the thinning of the air when power begins to drift. When something ancient and unspoken coils itself tight in the belly of a room. Evelyn sat stiffly in 3C, but her presence filled the space like a storm cloud trapped under a low ceiling. She wasn't done, and Maya knew it. Passengers settled back into their seats with the fragile comfort of those who pretend a fire isn't burning just beyond the door. Some lifted their magazines higher. Others turned toward the windows, feigning interest in the runway. But every now and then, Maya could feel their eyes brush over her, brief and fleeting like shadows. She felt it in the way Evelyn crossed her legs, too sharply, in the way Deborah, the flight supervisor, lingered a little too long at the front of the cabin, glancing back toward Maya with eyes that apologized without words. Greg, the attendant, passed by with a polite but thin smile. Anything I can get you before we take off? Miss Coleman? Maya returned his smile, small and restrained. I'm fine, thank you. Greg nodded and turned away. But Maya caught the way his eyes flickered toward Evelyn's seat as if to say, I hope that's true. But it wasn't. 15 minutes passed, and the engines hadn't roared to life. No cabin announcement had been made. The delay lingered, stretching its fingers across the plane, until even the most patient travelers began shifting in their seats. Maya watched as Evelyn leaned into her companion, a brunette woman who hadn't spoken much but whose nervous glances betrayed that she wished she had sat this flight out altogether. Evelyn whispered, and though Maya could not hear the words, she didn't need to. She had heard them before in office corridors, at fundraising galas, In places where people spoke of decorum while quietly erasing the ground beneath someone else's feet. "I'm going to have this fixed," Evelyn finally declared, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "This is absurd." Maya exhaled slowly. Evelyn stood again, her heels tapping down the aisle with the deliberate rhythm of someone who wanted to be seen. Wanted to be heard. She headed for the front of the plane, stopping just beneath the muted glow of the no smoking sign, where Deborah waited with a clipboard pressed tightly to her chest. The conversation began in hushed tones. "But anger isn't known for staying quiet. You're really not going to do anything about this?" Evelyn's voice lifted, high and sharp enough to snag the attention of those seated nearby. "I told you, I always sit in 1A. This is completely unacceptable." Deborah's response was too soft for Maya to hear. But it wasn't enough to cool Evelyn's rising frustration. "I understand she paid for the seat," Evelyn hissed, the emphasis on the word hanging in the air like smoke. "But is it really worth all this trouble? You're going to inconvenience everyone on this flight over what? Some technicality?" Maya's heart slowed, but her breath deepened. It was always this moment. The pivot, the narrowing of the road, where the matter transformed from a personal grievance into something else, something larger. Something uglier. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about the way Evelyn said she. Maya had heard it countless times before, folded into polite conversation and wrapped in soft fabric. But now, Evelyn wasn't bothering to hide it. The mask had slipped. Passengers squirmed as the words sank in, pressing deeper than perhaps Evelyn had intended. Greg stepped in, murmuring something that Maya guessed was an attempt to de-escalate. But Evelyn waved him off, her frustration ballooning past the point of retrieval. "Maybe you're not hearing me," Evelyn snapped, her voice tightening like a fist. "I don't want to sit behind her for the entire flight." The plane felt smaller then, as if the cabin itself had shrunk beneath the weight of her words. Maya glanced toward the window, letting the reflection stare back at her. She had learned long ago that silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She let Evelyn's voice fill the space because she understood something Evelyn did not. The more Evelyn spoke, the smaller she became. The murmurs began to ripple behind her. Passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. Deborah's voice finally rose above Evelyn's, firm but measured. "Mrs. Blake, I must ask you to return to your seat immediately." Evelyn's lips pulled tight, and for a moment, Maya saw the flash of realization she had pushed too far. "This isn't over," Evelyn muttered, brushing past Deborah and returning to her seat. But the confidence she carried before had begun to wither. As Evelyn sat down, Maya heard her companion whisper, "You need to stop. People are watching." Evelyn folded her arms, glaring straight ahead. Maya finally turned her gaze from the window, meeting Evelyn's reflection in the glass with calm, steady eyes. Evelyn looked away first, but Maya knew what Evelyn couldn't yet admit: the world was still watching. And some storms, once set in motion, cannot be called back. The tension didn't leave the cabin. It sat there, thick and unmoving, like a glass of water filled to the very brim still, but one breath away from spilling over. Evelyn Blake sat rigidly in her seat, arms crossed over her chest, tapping her fingers impatiently against her armrest. Every few moments, she glanced toward the front of the plane, not with curiosity, but with expectation. It wasn't over. Maya knew that much. Evelyn was waiting for the right moment, the right ally, the right leverage to tip the balance back in her favor. Maya turned another page in her notebook, pretending to write, but her pen hovered just above the paper. The weight of Evelyn's presence tugged at the edge of her consciousness, like a low, steady thrum beneath the surface of calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The intercom crackled to life, and every head lifted slightly, as if this announcement might signal the end of whatever strange hold had gripped the plane. "We apologize for the slight delay. We'll be taxiing to the runway shortly and expect a smooth flight to Chicago." The cabin exhaled in unison. But Evelyn didn't. Maya caught at the way Evelyn shifted in her seat, leaning toward the aisle, her lips pursed as if the captain's words were a personal slight. The plane might move forward, but Evelyn wasn't ready to let go. And then, just as Maya expected, Evelyn pressed the call button. A soft ding echoed through the cabin, a seemingly harmless sound, but one that felt louder than the captain's voice had moments before. Greg appeared within seconds, the polite mask still firmly in place, but his shoulders just a little stiffer this time. Yes, Mrs. Blake? I need to speak to the captain. Evelyn's tone left no room for negotiation. Greg blinked, clearly thrown off. Is there an issue I can help you with? Evelyn didn't so much as glance at him. I wasn't speaking to you. I need to speak to someone who has the authority to handle this properly. Maya set her pen down, folding her hands calmly in her lap, watching the scene unfold like the beginning of an old story she already knew the ending to. Mrs. Blake, Greg's voice lowered, I can assure you that the captain is focused on preparing the flight for takeoff. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. I am a Platinum Elite member. I have earned the right to voice my concerns directly to the captain. I will not be dismissed. Greg hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Maya saw the same old crossroads appear. This was not about policies or seating charts anymore, this was about expectation. Evelyn wasn't fighting for a seat. She was fighting for the reaffirmation of something much deeper. Something unspoken but well worn into the foundation of the world she lived in. Greg shifted uncomfortably. The rules were clear, but Evelyn's tone, cloaked in the thin veil of polite indignation, suggested consequences that didn't live on the printed pages of airline policy. Let me see what I can do, Greg finally said, retreating toward the front of the plane. Maya exhaled slowly. Evelyn leaned back in her seat with the sharp satisfaction of someone who believed the pieces were finally sliding into place. But the glass had already started to crack. Minutes passed, and Greg returned, followed closely by Deborah. Mrs. Blake, Deborah began, carefully crouching next to Evelyn's seat, keeping her voice low but steady. I understand you'd like to speak to the captain, but I must inform you that this matter has already been resolved. It hasn't, Evelyn interrupted, her eyes flashing. If it were resolved, I wouldn't be sitting back here. A murmur rolled quietly through the passengers around them, the cabin slowly unraveling into small clusters of whispers. Maya remained still, her hands never leaving the edges of her notebook. I'm afraid there's nothing more to discuss. Deborah pressed gently. We need you to remain in your assigned seat. Evelyn's smile returned, but there was nothing soft about it. Then I guess I'll just have to handle this after the flight. The words were delivered with enough weight that they felt like a threat. And Deborah's polite facade flickered. Just for a moment. Maya saw it. Evelyn saw it. And that was the moment Evelyn had been waiting for. She glanced toward Maya as if to say, see, this is how things work. But before Evelyn could lean back, content with whatever victory she believed she had secured, Maya spoke for the first time. Mrs. Blake, Maya said softly, tilting her head just enough to meet Evelyn's gaze. I'm curious, what exactly do you think happens after this flight? Evelyn blinked. I'm just wondering. Maya continued, her tone calm but deliberate. Because I have a call scheduled with your airline's board of directors in the morning. I'd be happy to add this to the agenda if you feel that would help. The words were not loud, but they spread like fire. Passengers who had been avoiding the unfolding scene now turned their attention fully toward Maya. Even Deborah froze, caught between surprise and quiet understanding. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. Maya leaned forward just enough that Evelyn could feel the weight of her presence. But not so much as to invade her space. You seem very confident that this is going to end the way you expect. Maya continued, her voice lowering, but I think you've miscalculated. Evelyn's shoulders stiffened. You're used to people bending. Maya added, and I understand why, but I've been in rooms far more uncomfortable than this one. And I don't bend easily. The glass didn't shatter in that moment, but it splintered enough for everyone to hear it. Evelyn's gaze broke first. She shifted in her seat, looking away as if the window could save her. Deborah rose to her feet slowly, giving Maya the smallest of nods. She turned toward the front of the plane, quietly signaling Greg to return to his post. Maya settled back into her seat. It wasn't over, not yet. But now Evelyn understood what Maya had known from the beginning. Some fights were won quietly, long before the first punch was ever thrown. The cabin had grown too quiet. That kind of quiet that doesn't soothe but sharpens. Stretching between the rows of seats like a drawn wire, ready to snap. Evelyn hadn't spoken since Maya's words settled over her like heavy cloth, suffocating the flames she tried to fan. But silence didn't mean surrender. No, Evelyn's pride was too deeply rooted for that. She wore it like perfume, heavy, cloying, impossible to ignore even as it faded into the background. Maya felt it before she saw it, the way Evelyn shifted slightly in her seat. The smallest movement that carried the weight of someone not finished with the fight. The plane finally began its taxi. Engines humming louder, filling the gaps where words might have otherwise clashed. For a brief moment, Maya wondered if the storm had, in fact, passed. But then Evelyn leaned toward her companion, her voice low but laced with bitterness that could no longer be concealed. "She thinks she's teaching me something," Evelyn muttered. "These people always think they're making some grand point." Maya didn't need to hear the rest to know how the sentence ended. Her fingers curled gently around the leather of her notebook. But she didn't turn. She didn't flinch. Let it hang there. Let Evelyn's words expose themselves. Unravel like thread from the fabric she had so carefully woven around her image. But Evelyn wasn't content with whispers. The poison needed air. "She's probably just another diversity hire," Evelyn said, this time loud enough for the rows ahead and behind to catch fragments of the phrase. "You know how that goes. Handouts and quotas." The air inside the cabin shifted again, barely perceptible. But Maya felt it. So did everyone else. The ripple moved from seat to seat. A collective discomfort that settled like a fog no one could quite push aside. Greg, the flight attendant, lingered near the front of the cabin, pretending to check the overhead compartments, though Maya could see the way his eyes flicked toward Evelyn's row. Deborah, too, stood near the galley, her clipboard tight against her chest as if to anchor her. They were all waiting. Maya closed her notebook slowly, placing it on the tray table with deliberate care. When she spoke, her voice didn't rise, but the calmness in it was heavy enough to pull the whole cabin down with her. "Mrs. Blake," Maya began without turning her head, "I'd ask you to choose your next words carefully." Evelyn laughed softly, sharp and biting, the way a cornered animal bares its teeth. "I don't need to choose my words," Evelyn replied, leaning back in her seat. "This isn't about words. This is about the fact that I'm sitting back here while you're sitting up there pretending to belong." The final thread snapped. Maya turned her head, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes locked onto Evelyn's, and for the first time, she let the silence stretch between them, heavy and unrelenting. There was no anger in Maya's gaze. But there was something worse. Certainty. Certainty that Evelyn had misstepped. Certainty that whatever ground Evelyn believed she stood on was crumbling beneath her. "Pretending to belong," Maya repeated softly, as if testing the phrase. "Is that what you think this is?" Evelyn didn't answer. "You seem to be under the impression," Maya continued, her voice threading through the cabin like steel wrapped in silk, "that belonging is something handed to you. That it comes with points and perks. With how many champagne glasses you've clinked in the first-class lounge. But that's not belonging, Mrs. Blake. That's proximity." Maya leaned forward just enough to close the space between them, but not enough to intimidate. "And proximity isn't power." The words hit with a quiet force that seemed to shift the air, grounding everyone who heard them. Evelyn's smirk faded, but she wasn't ready to fold. "Not yet. You know what I mean," Evelyn said, her voice thin now. "You people always twist things to sound more profound than they are." Maya smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Perhaps," Maya said, leaning back in her seat. "Or perhaps the problem isn't the way I speak. Perhaps the problem is that you expected silence." Evelyn's mouth opened, but no words came. The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane began to climb. Maya let the silence stretch again, but this time she let it rest like a crown on her shoulders. She had no intention of carrying Evelyn's discomfort any further. Instead, she opened her notebook again, the smooth slide of her pen across paper returning with the same deliberate ease as before. The plane pressed higher into the sky, but Evelyn's seat felt lower than it had when she first boarded. Maya didn't need to say anything more. Some lessons are best left unfinished, left hanging in the space where pride and consequence collide. It wasn't the kind of ending Evelyn was used to. But Maya understood something Evelyn did not. Sometimes the only way to win is to make the world watch someone else lose. The plane had long since leveled out, gliding smooth and steady through the high-altitude silence. But the tension inside the cabin remained, unbroken and sharp-edged, clinging to the air like static before a storm. Evelyn hadn't spoken since Maya's last words cut the floor from under her. But there was something about silence that could be just as loud, especially when it festered. Evelyn sat rigid in her seat, her gaze locked out the window. But every so often, her reflection flickered against the glass, and Maya saw it for what it was. A battle not yet surrendered. Maya returned to her notes. But even as her pen moved across the page, she felt the weight of Evelyn's stare, circling like a hawk waiting for an opening. It came in the form of a flight attendant. Greg returned, pushing a narrow cart of drinks and snacks down the aisle. His smile was polite, but Maya caught the way his eyes danced nervously between passengers, searching for the tension he couldn't quite avoid. "Miss Coleman, can I offer you something to drink?" Maya glanced up, the softness of her smile returning like muscle memory. "Just water, thank you." Greg nodded, reaching for a bottle, and then Evelyn's voice slid in from behind him, low and sharp enough to make the air colder. "She'll take the champagne," Evelyn said. Greg hesitated, hand hovering over the drink selection. Maya's smile thinned, but she didn't turn around. "I asked for water." Evelyn leaned forward now, just enough for her voice to carry beyond her seat. "Oh, come on, it's first class, isn't it? Live a little." Greg shifted uncomfortably. Maya watched the moment unfold in slow motion. The way Evelyn's words twisted, dressed in the false fabric of generosity, but woven from something else entirely. It wasn't about champagne, it was about spectacle. Evelyn wanted a stage, even if the audience wasn't paying attention. Maya lifted her eyes to Greg, catching the subtle plea behind his neutral expression. He didn't want to be here, tangled in this quiet war. "I'll take the water," Maya repeated gently, but her gaze lingered long enough for Greg to understand that her kindness was a choice. Greg nodded, placing the bottle on her tray table with careful precision. He started to move forward, but Evelyn wasn't ready to let him escape. "What about me?" Evelyn asked, louder this time. "Do I get to drink? Or is that another privilege I've lost today?" The cart rattled to a stop. Maya's fingers tightened subtly around the water bottle. Greg turned, masking his discomfort behind the same polished professionalism he'd worn throughout the flight. "Of course, Mrs. Blake, what can I get for you?" Evelyn's smile returned, all teeth. She tilted her head just slightly, flicking her hair over one shoulder with the effortless precision of someone who understood exactly how to command a room. "I'll have the champagne," she said, locking eyes with Maya. "And maybe you should pour her a glass too. It's hard to stay bitter when you're drinking the good stuff." A few scattered chuckles drifted from passengers nearby, though they felt hesitant, half-formed, as if the humor came at a cost they hadn't yet calculated. Maya met Evelyn's gaze for the first time since the exchange began. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She let the silence stretch between them, thin but taut, until Evelyn's smirk began to fray at the edges. "Mrs. Blake," Maya said softly, "it seems you're misunderstanding the difference between bitterness and boundaries." Evelyn's fingers tensed around the armrest. "I could drink your champagne," Maya continued, voice low but steady. "I could sit here and pretend that's all this is. But you and I both know that champagne doesn't wash away contempt." The passengers weren't pretending not to listen anymore. Heads turned, subtle and careful, but watching nonetheless. Evelyn's mouth twitched, but no words came. Maya leaned slightly forward, just enough to close the distance without breaking the calm veneer she wore like armor. "So I'll take the water," she said quietly, "because some of us don't need bubbles to make our place in this world feel permanent." Greg cleared his throat, the tension too thick for him to ignore now. He poured Evelyn's champagne swiftly, setting it on her tray without another word. Evelyn didn't touch it. Maya's hand hovered over the water bottle, but she didn't drink yet. She waited, watching as Evelyn shifted in her seat, eyes flicking toward the glass, the weight of the moment pressing heavy against her. The plane felt smaller, the cabin closer, and Evelyn's storm, the one she had so confidently stirred, was unraveling. But Maya didn't take pleasure in it. She didn't need to. The point had already been made. The cabin lights had dimmed, casting soft shadows along the aisle, but there was no mistaking the energy that lingered in the air. Conversations had settled into a low murmur, punctuated by the occasional clink of glasses and the rustle of blankets being adjusted. But even in that quiet, Maya could feel at the sharp edge Evelyn was walking. Evelyn's untouched champagne sat on the tray before her, the golden liquid trembling slightly with every shift of the plane. Her fingers rested near the stem, but she hadn't lifted it. Not since Maya's words had settled between them like a blade placed gently but unmistakably on the table. It was an old tension, ancient even, the kind passed down through generations, shifting but never truly vanishing. Maya had learned to live with it the way one lives with the pull of gravity, constant, inevitable, pressing. But tonight, she wasn't interested in bearing the weight quietly. Evelyn's companion, a quiet woman whose presence seemed smaller with every passing hour, leaned toward her, whispering something Maya couldn't hear. Evelyn's response came in a hushed hiss. But Maya caught the tail end of it. "I'm not apologizing to her." Maya let the words sit there, untouched. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them. But Evelyn wasn't done. The glass finally lifted from the tray, and Maya listened as Evelyn took a slow sip, drawing out the motion as if that, in itself, was a declaration. The sound of the glass returning to the table seemed louder than it should have been. And then Evelyn spoke, just loud enough for Maya to hear but soft enough to maintain plausible deniability. "I don't know why people like her always feel the need to make a scene." The words were a whisper, but they cut with the precision of something long rehearsed. And Maya recognized them immediately, not as Evelyn's original thought, but as a well-worn inheritance. Greg, still hovering near the galley, heard it too. Maya saw the faint shift in his stance, the nervous tug at his cuff. Deborah, standing near the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane, met Maya's eyes briefly, as if to silently ask, "How far is this going to go?" Maya set her notebook aside, the soft thud of leather meeting wood echoing louder than she anticipated. She turned in her seat. Slowly, deliberately, her eyes met Evelyn's, and this time there was no soft veil of politeness between them. "I find it interesting," Maya said, her voice calm but carrying enough weight to stop the surrounding conversations. "How often I hear that line, people like her." Evelyn's grip on the champagne glass faltered for half a second. "I'd ask you to clarify what you mean," Maya continued, tilting her head slightly, "but I suspect the answer wouldn't surprise me." Evelyn straightened, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, don't twist my words. I'm sure you know exactly what I meant." "I do," Maya replied, her gaze steady. "That's the problem." The hum of the engines seemed to deepen, grounding the moment as the weight of Maya's words settled over the cabin. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Maya leaned forward slightly, cutting her off with nothing more than the quiet authority that had carried her through countless rooms like this. "I've spent a lifetime in spaces that weren't built for me," Maya said, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through the thin fabric of Evelyn's pretense. "And I've heard every version of what you just said, wrapped in polite smiles, hidden behind jokes, whispered across dinner tables where I was the only one who didn't look like the host." Evelyn's smirk faltered. "But let me tell you something," Maya continued, her eyes narrowing just enough for Evelyn to feel the weight behind them. "The only person making a scene here tonight is you." The silence that followed wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, controlled. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes flicking toward the exchange but careful not to stare too long. Evelyn's companion reached for her arm, tugging lightly. "Evelyn, maybe we should." "No," Evelyn snapped, pulling away. She straightened, forcing that brittle smile back into place, as though reconstructing the fragile pieces of the world she thought she controlled. "I was just speaking my mind," Evelyn said, louder now, hoping the cabin would rally behind her. "Isn't that what everyone's so fond of these days? Free speech and all that?" Maya didn't blink. "Speech is free," she said, "but consequences come at a cost." Greg stepped forward then, sensing the shift, though he hesitated just long enough to see if Maya needed rescuing. She didn't. Evelyn opened her mouth again, but this time it wasn't Maya who responded. It was the passenger across the aisle, a man who had been quiet the entire flight, now lowering his newspaper with a sigh. "I think she's made her point, lady," he said. His voice was weathered, worn by years of living, but there was no mistaking the sharpness in it. Evelyn turned sharply. "Excuse me?" The man shrugged, folding the paper and tucking it neatly by his side. "I've been sitting here for hours listening to you talk yourself into a corner. Maybe it's time to let it go." A murmur of agreement followed, quiet but firm, drifting in from 2 or 3 rows behind. Evelyn's face flushed, whether from embarrassment or rage. Maya couldn't tell, but the glass in her hand trembled slightly before she set it down for good. The flight pressed on, the minutes crawling forward as the confrontation dissolved, leaving behind only the soft rustle of papers and the distant hum of the engines. Maya turned back to her window, the reflection staring back at her once again. She didn't need to win out loud. Sometimes, the sound of breaking glass was enough. The hum of the engines filled the cabin like white noise. But beneath it, something else simmered, quiet, yet undeniable. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy. Not because words were absent, but because too many had been left unsaid. Maya felt it pressing at the edges of the space around her, just as surely as she felt the eyes that lingered longer than they should. Evelyn hadn't spoken again, but silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it simply means the shape of the fight has changed. A flight attendant passed by, offering soft smiles and warm towels, trying to patch over something that could not be smoothed away. Maya accepted the gesture with a nod, watching as Evelyn's companion leaned in toward her once more, lips moving in a hushed plea Maya could not hear. Evelyn's response was sharper this time, though she kept her voice low. But Maya didn't need to hear the words to understand them. Some messages are carried in the tension of a jawline, in the stiff way someone holds their shoulders, in the flick of a wrist that dismisses kindness as weakness. Evelyn wasn't interested in kindness. Maya turned back to the window, but her reflection followed her, eyes sharp and steady against the fading sky outside. She had spent enough time in this country to know the shape of what was happening. It wasn't just about Evelyn. It was about the way this moment felt familiar, the way it stretched across time, echoing the voices of people long gone, those who had been forced to fight battles they never started, in rooms they were never truly invited into. And the weight of that history, its ghost, now sat between Maya and Evelyn like a third passenger. Unseen but impossible to ignore. She exhaled slowly, fingers tracing the edge of the leather-bound notebook that rested on her lap. That was the thing about people like Evelyn. They didn't know how much history they carried with them. They didn't realize that the bitterness they wore like a badge was not theirs alone. It had been passed down, piece by piece, over generations, like an heirloom crafted not from gold, but from fear. And fear, when left unchecked, had a way of making even the smallest people feel dangerous. The attendant reappeared moments later, her smile still carefully affixed. But Maya caught the flicker of hesitation in her eyes as she approached Evelyn's row. "Mrs. Blake," the attendant said softly, "the captain has asked me to check in with you. Is there anything I can do to make you more comfortable during the remainder of the flight?" It was an olive branch, thinly veiled but extended nonetheless. Evelyn glanced toward Maya, her lips curling into something that resembled a smirk but lacked conviction. "No," she replied coolly, eyes lingering on Maya for just a beat too long. "I think I'm quite comfortable now." Maya felt the words settle around her like smoke, curling at the edges of her space but refusing to choke her. She met Evelyn's gaze without blinking. "Good," Maya said simply, her voice steady as stone. "I'm glad." The attendant hesitated for a brief moment, eyes flicking nervously between the two women as if weighing which direction to lean toward. Maya smiled softly, letting the tension in the room speak for itself. Evelyn's companion shifted uncomfortably, fingers gripping the edges of the tray table as if bracing for impact that had not yet come. But Maya wasn't interested in conflict. Not anymore. She understood something Evelyn didn't, that some fights aren't won through force. They are won in the quiet places, where patience stretches thinner than thread and silence carries the weight of generations. Evelyn might not have known that history, but Maya did. She carried it in her bones, in the lines of her palms, in the quiet resilience of people who had been told to move, to wait, to stay quiet, and who, despite everything, still refused to disappear. The flight drifted forward, cutting through clouds that hung low and heavy. But the air inside the cabin felt sharper now, charged with the lingering energy of something unresolved. Maya let her eyes close for a moment, letting the steady rhythm of the engines pull her focus elsewhere. She could feel Evelyn's presence like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. But she no longer allowed it to shape the moment. The fight, she knew, was already over, not because Evelyn had lost, but because Maya had refused to play by the rules Evelyn believed in. And that, perhaps, was the deepest fracture of all. The plane had begun its slow descent, dipping beneath the veil of clouds as the city lights flickered faintly below. There was a strange stillness in the cabin now, a collective breath held tight, as if the passengers sensed the undercurrent but dared not speak of it aloud. Evelyn hadn't moved. Her champagne glass remained untouched, fingers resting lightly against the stem as though the gesture itself was enough to hold on to what little power remained. Maya sat with her eyes forward, but her attention lingered just beyond her, where Evelyn's presence felt like a flickering light refusing to go out. It wasn't over. Not yet. Some conflicts didn't fade at cruising altitude, they tightened during the descent. Waiting for the moment feet touched ground, Greg passed through the aisle, his polite mask firmly back in place. But the tension beneath it betrayed the truth. He was tired. Tired of the long shadow Evelyn had cast over the flight. Tired of the dance required to keep such passengers satisfied without igniting the flames they carried in their pockets. And Maya knew that exhaustion. It was the exhaustion of those asked to bear the weight of other people's comfort. The exhaustion of existing in rooms where the smallest mistake or refusal could make the difference between belonging and exile. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats and ensure your tray tables are in the upright position. The captain's voice cracked over the intercom, cutting through the thick quiet. But the words did little to dissolve the knot coiled at the center of the cabin. Evelyn shifted then, sitting straighter, her gaze flicking toward Maya like the glance of someone taking measure. Recalculating the terms of a war they thought they'd already won. Maya felt it, the lingering question behind Evelyn's stare. How far are you willing to take this? But Maya had already taken it further than Evelyn could have imagined. It was never about shouting. It was never about grand declarations or public battles. The fight Evelyn had walked into wasn't staged on her terms, it existed in the spaces between words. In the simple refusal to yield. Maya tilted her head, catching Evelyn's gaze without hesitation. You seem uncomfortable, Maya said quietly, though her voice carried enough force to reach across the aisle. Evelyn's lips tightened into something resembling a smile, though the edges cracked beneath the weight of it. I'm perfectly fine, Evelyn replied, her words clipped and cold. But thank you for your concern. The irony wasn't lost on Maya. The same woman who had spent the last 3 hours attempting to displace her now feigned composure. Good, Maya said, leaning back against her seat. I'd hate to think I had ruined your flight. Evelyn opened her mouth, ready to snap back, but something held her still, perhaps the eyes of the passengers nearby. Watching closely now, perhaps the faintest realization that this fight, too, was slipping through her fingers. The landing gear unfolded with a soft rumble beneath their feet. As the plane lowered, Maya felt the shift, the weight of Evelyn's pride dangling precariously, like glass balanced on a ledge. One wrong step, and it would shatter. Greg passed by once more, clearing trays with the kind of cautious efficiency that suggested he wanted nothing more than to escape the moment. Maya watched as he approached Evelyn's row, his eyes flickering between her and the untouched glass of champagne. Would you like me to take that, Mrs. Blake? He asked gently. Evelyn's hand hovered over the glass for a moment, but then she released it, letting Greg clear the tray without another word. There was no victory in it, not for Evelyn. But for Maya, there was something else, a quiet certainty. As the wheels touched down, the cabin jolted slightly, and Evelyn's companion let out a soft sigh of relief, as though the ground itself might dissolve the tension that had clung to them in the air. But Maya knew better. The weight of this moment wouldn't disappear. It would follow Evelyn, trailing her off the plane, pressing against her shoulders in the days to come. Because that was how the world worked. Whether Evelyn wanted to admit it or not. It wasn't about one seat. It wasn't about one flight. It was about something deeper, the slow, undeniable collapse of the certainty Evelyn thought she had been born with. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Maya caught Deborah's eyes from the front of the cabin. There was no apology in them, but there was recognition, a subtle, silent acknowledgement of what had transpired. And sometimes, that was enough. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and the plane exhaled as passengers gathered their belongings. Evelyn rose from her seat with practiced grace, but her movements were stiffer now, as if each step required more effort than before. Maya waited, letting the aisle clear, allowing Evelyn to pass without another glance. She didn't need to say anything more. Some lessons aren't taught in the moment. They bloom slowly, in the quiet spaces that follow, growing like roots beneath the surface. Unseen but powerful enough to shift the ground beneath your feet.